You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these events are the beginning of birth pains. All the things that are taking place in our world today. We know of Ukraine and Russia, the war there, the war between Israel and Hamas. Are these the prophesied wars and the rumors of wars, the nations rising against nations and the kingdoms rising against kingdoms? Are these what was prophesied about by Jesus Christ in the New Testament? Are these the beginning of birth pains? And the answer to that, clearly, is no. No. Today in this video, I'm going to talk about how this passage is clearly fulfilled in the first century, nearly 2,000 years ago. I love diving into the historical context of the Bible. It's one of my passions. And I remember during COVID 2020 reading the Bible and just reading Matthew 23 and seeing kind of that context there, Jesus setting up the Olivet Discourse. He had denounced the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You see that over and over. And he says, all the righteous blood shed on the earth will be charged to you, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you, first century Jews, who you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. I assure you, all these things will come on this generation. So all of this woe, all of this condemnation, the measure of their father's sins, this condemnation to hell, that's going to come upon this generation of Jews that Jesus was speaking to, the Pharisees, that generation of the Jews. So Jesus gets there, and then he weeps over Jerusalem, the city that he loves. But he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. If you remember the story in, I think it's 1st or 2nd Samuel, of Ichabod, the glory of God has departed. Jesus says, for I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In other words, the Jews, unless they recognize Jesus as Messiah, they're going to be judged in that generation. So you move on from Matthew 23 to the next chapter, Matthew 24. As Jesus left and was going out of the temple, he's leaving the temple complex, his disciples came up and called his attention to the temple buildings. Then Jesus replied to them, don't you see all these things? All what things? Well, the temple buildings. Don't you see all these temple buildings? I assure you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. In other words, there's going to be the destruction of the temple. It's coming, and it's coming soon. And the disciples probably are very confused when he says this, because the temple was finished very recently in that time period, or was being finished. And it was amazing. It was beautiful, the most ornate temple at that time in all of Israelite history. But then they keep going. The signs of the end of the age. While Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him privately and said, tell us, when will these things happen? What things? Well, the destruction of the temple buildings, the throwing down of the stones of the temple, the judgment on that land and the temple. When will these things happen? What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Then Jesus replied to them, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these events are the beginning of birth pains. So Jesus is talking about the end of the age, and I view this not as the end of the world as we know it, but the end of the old covenant order, the end of the old covenant age, because Jesus had arrived. He's bringing forward the new covenant. Of course, he establishes the new covenant in his blood at the cross by his sacrifice and in his resurrection. And the sign of the end of the old covenant would be the destruction of the temple complex, the sign of the Son of Man. You can read Matthew 26 for that. But Jesus answers the disciples' question, when will these things happen? When will the temple be destroyed? And keep in mind, once again, this is in the first century, nearly 2,000 years ago, as Jesus is speaking not to us in the 21st century American church. No, Jesus is speaking to the Jewish disciples. And he says, here's the beginning of birth pains, all these events, the wars and rumors of wars, the nations against nations, earthquakes and famines, and ironically, coincidentally, famines, earthquakes, nation against nation, wars, rumors of wars, all of that actually took place even in the book of Acts. You see famines, you see the earthquakes taking place, and historically speaking, in the time from Jesus' earthly ministry until the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD, there were wars on the borders of the kingdom of Rome, and there were rumors of wars because they were at the time in a time of peace, and there were a lot of insurrections. The Jewish rebellions took place before the temple was destroyed, a few years before that, and it worked its way up to that destruction. So a lot of this, clearly, if you just kind of go through Roman history even, all these things did take place, and you see it in the Bible as well. Even the Apostle Paul is collecting some money for the Jerusalem church because there's a famine in the land. Anyway, all these things did take place in that generation, and Jesus continues to go on. He's speaking to Jewish Christians, Jewish believers that followed him, and he's warning them. He's giving them a forewarning, that then they will hand you over for persecution. They will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Who will persecute them? Well, as Revelation says, the synagogue of Satan, the Jewish people who rebelled against God, who rejected Jesus as their king, as Christ, as Messiah. They rejected him. And if you read the book of Acts, the entire book, you see that the Jewish people who did not believe in Jesus, they were the biggest persecutors of the church, of believers in Jesus. You see that even in the Apostle Paul, when he's standing before Felix and the Jewish people, the Jewish men are coming against him, trying to murder him and kill him and accuse him of things he never did. So false prophets will come. You see that in the book of Acts as well. Lawlessness, you see that in the book of Acts. The love of many is growing cold, but the one who endures to the end will be delivered. The end of what? The end of the world as we know it? I would argue no. The end of the Old Covenant age, especially for these disciples who were about to enter into the hardest time of their life under that persecution from AD 33 to AD 70, which many of the disciples didn't live till that time except John. And then he says, the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world. This world is oikomene. All of the Roman Empire is a better translation, as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. This word is telos. The goal will come. The closing act will come. So not the end of the world. It's more kind of the goal, the aim of Jesus's ministry, and the sign that he is the Son of Man, the Son of God. I think the closing act of Old Covenant history, that will come. Then we talk about the temple and, the temple being desecrated, and then this great tribulation. Of course, Jesus says when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, I don't know about you, but you and I do not live in Judea. A lot of us are Americans or Westerners, and he's speaking to, the disciples in the first century. This would be extremely relevant to them. If you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. Now, what is this abomination that causes desolation? Desolation means like to be abandoned. It's an abandonment. So if you read Luke's gospel, this abomination of desolation is translated so that Gentiles can understand what this means, because Matthew is a very Jewish gospel. He's trying to communicate to the Jewish people. But if you just go to Luke 21, you'll see very, very clearly, not one stone will be left on another. As some were talking about the temple complex, same thing, beautiful stones and the gifts of the temple. Jesus is talking about the destruction here. And he's talking about the signs of the end of the age. Same Olivet Discourse, the destruction of Jerusalem. But he clarifies, the abomination of desolation. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that its desolation, its abandonment has come near. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those inside the city must leave it, and those who are in the country must not enter it, because the days of vengeance to fulfill all the things, because these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all the things that are written. Woe to pregnant women in those, woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Those days, not 21st century America, first century Israel. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. I've heard of a lot of women today who think that the rapture and the Great Tribulation is coming in our future, and they're tempted to not get pregnant and have children and get married because they think, this is applying to our future today, but it's clearly not. Jesus is speaking to the Jewish disciples in his time period. For there will be great distress in the land of Israel and wrath against this people. In other words, wrath against the people of Israel, the ethnic Jews, the ethnic Israelites. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles, the Romans, until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Of course, that did take place. The destruction of the temple was an occurrence. So, this abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, is the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. When people saw the Roman armies coming down, the abomination of desolation, of course, Jesus said, you better get out of there. And historically, there were Christian Jews who fled. They left Judea and they fled to a town called Pella, and they escaped in that time period before the year 70 AD, or during that year in that time period. They escaped. Why? Because Jesus had said this was going to happen. A lot of this, again, is very relevant to that first century audience. Pray that your escape would not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. The Jews are the ones that kept Sabbath in that sense, in that Jewish kind of Old Covenant sense. And then for at that time, there will be great tribulation, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. You see this language all over the Old Testament. If you read it literalistically, a lot of people would say, well, Jesus clearly said that the Great Tribulation, that it would be of a magnitude that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. Well, I think this is a more hyperbolic language. You see this in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, describing the wickedness of certain kings. It says there was, no worse king, nor was there ever, a more wicked king. But then you keep going down, and there's wicked kings after. So all that, what I'm getting at here really is just Jesus is just saying this is going to be a really, really bad time. Sorry if that was confusing, but there's going to be a big tribulation. And we know, according to the historical writings of Josephus, that there was nearly 1 million Jews killed in this destruction. But, of course, Christ saves the remnant of believing Jews. They escape. And he continues to warn them, don't believe people when they say that they're the Messiah, or they're going to lead you astray, even if they perform great signs and wonders. Jesus says, take note, I have told you in advance. Don't go out. Don't go looking for people who claim to be Messiah. It's not me. The judgment is coming. But just to end this video, we've talked about all these events that are going to take place. Jesus is telling his disciples that from the time he was speaking to them until the time of the temple destruction, about a 40-year period, all these things would take place. And then he finally says, ultimately, that I assure you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. And then in the verse before that, he says, in the same way, he says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. As soon as its branches becomes tender and it sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the door. I assure you that this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. There are some scholars who think heaven and earth as well. A lot of, if I'm not mistaken, there's scholars who believe in the book of Enoch, Enoch chapter 26, verse 1, a different Jewish literature, the temple itself is described as heaven and earth. So the Jews had this understanding that the temple, the physical temple, was heaven and earth, not literally, right, but in this metaphoric way. So it's almost as if Jesus is saying the temple will pass away, but my words will never pass away, because we don't need a temple anymore. We have Jesus and his Spirit dwelling in believers. The believers, the church of Jesus, the people of God, are the third and final and true temple of God. There is no need for this physical temple. So all that was going to take place. Once again, the wars, the rumors of wars, the tribulation of those days, all of the signs, this decreation language from Isaiah, where really it's just a language that points to a judgment that's coming on a localized city. You see Matthew is pulling this language from the Old Testament, and back then Isaiah said, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the celestial powers will be shaken. Isaiah used it in the context of Babylon being judged. Jesus is saying that, Jerusalem is actually now Babylon in this sense. Jerusalem is going to be judged, decreated, so to speak, and abandoned. So all these signs, the wars and rumors of wars, false messiahs, the armies that are going to surround Jerusalem, when you see all these things take place, all these things are going to take place within that generation. And then no one knows the day or the hour. Jesus speaks to his disciples, you're not going to know the day when I come and judge Jerusalem. So that's undisclosed to them. Just as judgment came in the days of Noah, judgment is going to come unexpectedly upon Jerusalem when people least expect it. They're going to scoff at you, disciples, the Jews, especially the unbelieving Jews, aren't going to believe that the judgment of Jesus is coming against Jerusalem. But certainly it did. We know that through the Roman armies under Vespasian and Titus in 70 AD. So all this to say, really want to encourage us to read passages like this in historical context, go down to the nitty-gritty, ask yourself, who is speaking in the story and who are they speaking to? And then I would say, like the Gospel of Matthew as a whole, for example, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, which is Matthew the disciple, and who is he sending this gospel or this letter to? So who is that original audience, and how did they understand the things going on in this text in that first century context, in that first century time period? What did this passage of the Bible mean to them in the first century. I keep saying that over and over, but I just think it's very important because a lot of men and women these days, a lot of young kids, they will read a passage of scripture. They'll hear wars and rumors of wars, and woe to pregnant women in those days. And they're going to be like, oh my gosh, the Great Tribulation is upon us. The preachers on the news and the headlines and all these American preachers are saying that the Great Tribulation is coming because Israel and Hamas are at war. Oh no, I shouldn't get pregnant, or, I shouldn't pursue this or that opportunity because the end is, we could be raptured tomorrow or whatever. That just hinders the gospel. I think that hinders discipleship, that hinders an optimistic view of the gospel going forward in the world. And it just breeds a lot of pessimism, negativity, and because we don't put this Bible passage in its proper context in that first century time, we pull it, we apply it, and we get scared. Of course, we should fear God's wrath. We should fear his holiness. But this fulfillment, this judgment on Jerusalem was the culmination of God's dealings with Old Covenant Israel. And it was this final closing act as well. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Didn't go through all of the Olivet Discourse. This is a difficult passage for many, but it can be made a lot easier, I think, when you take these measures, when you take these steps. And just remember, Jesus was speaking to that generation. Every time you see that word, this generation, in the Gospel of Matthew, he's referring to the people he's speaking to. And it doesn't change here. So may the Lord bless you guys and keep you guys. And I pray, my heart here is that you're helped and that you feel assisted in how you view the Bible, how you view its context, and how you approach it. The Bible just begins to come to life. It really does when you start to learn about the time in which it was written and what was going on, and then you see all the connections that the Old Testament is really just talking about the same things as the New. Jesus, he's the center of it all. Christ, Jesus, is the fulfillment of the promises in the Old Testament. So may that encourage y'all, and may you be blessed. Bye-bye.